This is the big problem that was in the lower court case, because they were trying to say irregularities must be associated with malice and or fraud. And this was a misreading of the Elections Act. Back in October, we broke down the lower court's ruling in the rejection of the Terrebonne election challenge case and warned about the precedent it could set. Now the Supreme Court has stepped in and overturned that decision. Today, we're going to compare what the court actually did with the legal framework we walked through months ago and why we feel the Supreme Court had no choice but to overturn that ruling and annul the election result. Let's take a look. So, ladies and gentlemen, we put out a short as we were in the middle of nowhere on our break last week, just to make sure everybody was informed of this important decision. But now we're going to take a little bit closer look. Now, the result actually isn't documented in a decision that we can review yet. We're still waiting on that. It was given via a oral decision in the court, but we are going to take you through some of the reporting of what was said in that court and the hearing and break it down. So this comes from the Canadian Press. Supreme Court invalidates result from spring federal election in Terrebonne riding, which all of us know now. The Supreme Court of Canada has invalidated a federal Liberal candidate's one-vote victory in last spring's federal election, pushing the governing party further away from a majority in the House of Commons. Liberal Tatiana Auguste has sat as a member of parliament since the spring after being declared the winner over Nathalie St-Clair-Desgagnés, the Bloc Québécois candidate. St-Clair-Desgagnés let out a long sigh of relief shortly after she heard the ruling announced from the bench following a hearing earlier on Friday. She challenged the election results and demanded a by-election after a Bloc Québécois supporter complained that she had tried to vote by mail using a special ballot that was never counted. The voter, Emmanuel Basse, said the special ballot was returned to her own mailbox due to an error on the postal code printed on a label supplied by Elections Canada. Quote, the Supreme Court decided today that every vote counts and that the vote of one person isn't worth more than the vote of another, and that, when there is a tie, there should be a new election, end quote, said St-Clair-Desgagnés, reacting to the decision. Quote, up until today, someone was representing the riding who, however, did not have the legitimacy to do so. Fortunately, this was corrected today, end quote. And you can see a picture of Emmanuel Basse there with the envelope in question. So back when the previous court rejected the decision, or rejected the argument of the Bloc, I should say, we found a lot of problems with that. And many of the problems that we found in that decision were actually based on another decision that the Supreme Court had made. So let's just play a little clip of what we said when we were looking at that and how that may pertain to what happened today.
63. Our approach to contested elections allows a judge to consider evidence that an individual was entitled to vote on election day. It has to be remembered that quote-unquote entitlement is concerned with age, citizenship, and residence. A judge may look at any evidence that is relevant to these criteria. This approach best ensures the accuracy of election results. Some prior jurisprudence in the lower court suggests that this approach introduces uncertainty into election results. 64. When a court decides a contested election case based on alleged, quote, irregularities that affected the result, end quote, it is faced with uncertainty as to the outcome of an election arising from allegations of errors in the administration of the election. A contested election decision, by addressing these alleged errors, is designed to remedy this uncertainty. An approach allowing for an examination of voter entitlement bolsters accuracy and confidence that only entitled persons cast ballots.
So what does all that mean? What this means is that the Supreme Court is saying that administrative mistakes are not just something you can fluff off. They're saying that it's actually really important to consider them when you're looking at this. And the Supreme Court is saying, on a balance of decision, you need to ensure that votes are counted versus not counted when faced with an administrative mistake. So we look at Terrbonne. An Elections Canada employee said, oopsie, I mailed out 40 special ballots with the wrong returning address, preventing them from actually being counted on election day, which is addressed in the paragraph 63. So you have a voter who's entitled to vote, who casts their vote properly, and they're trying to vote, and because of an administrative mistake, we're not able to do so. So note nowhere in here does it talk about malice, does it talk about intent, does it talk about anything, because it's not talking about fraud. That's separate. It's not talking about corruption. That's separate. It's talking about voter irregularity, which is by default going to be non-intent, non-malice, therefore administrative in nature. But the Terrbonne judge is trying to completely conflate those and merge them, contradicting what the Supreme Court actually said.
66. By contrast, if a vote cast by an entitled voter were to be rejected in a contested election application because of an irregularity, the voter would be irreparably disenfranchised. This is especially undesirable when the irregularity is outside of the voter's control and is caused solely by the error of an election official.
This is the bomb in this whole decision.
It sure is.
So what does that say to you?
To me, it says that if the voters done everything correctly, they would be disenfranchised to have their ballot rejected by an error caused by somebody at Elections Canada.
Right. So this is the Supreme Court effectively ruling on almost exactly what happened in Terrebonne.
Yeah, 13 years before it happened.
Right. Because what they were doing is ruling on the opposite scenario. And so they're saying, well, in this case, it's safer to just hold these votes here and include them in the count, and the election's going to stand. And then they go on to literally say, by contrast, if the Terrebonne scenario happened, that's a different story.
So contrasting what just happened in Terrebonne to what happened back in 2012, I think the judge in Terrebonne was incorrect.
Right. Now, it doesn't matter whether you're conservative, bloc, liberal, NDP, or otherwise. We have to look at, did the judge apply the law correctly? And based on everything that we've seen, the definition of an irregularity in the Elections Act, and what the Supreme Court actually ruled on in one of the most recent cases on this, they spelled it out clearly. This judge did not apply the law correctly. So, the crux of this, and we go on to say that in the previous video, is that if the Supreme Court were to uphold the lower court's decision in saying, no, this is rejected and there is no by-election and the election stands, it creates a very problematic precedent, because in the previous Supreme Court case, it was all about votes that were included in the election result and counted, and the argument was that they shouldn't have been counted. So they're saying, listen, if there's administrative errors, it's better to err on the side of caution and include votes. That way you're not disenfranchising voters. So that's the first case. But if this Supreme Court decision was agreeing with the lower court, you would have both ends of that spectrum blocked for appeal essentially permanently, because it would be saying, okay, so administrative errors that prevent voters from actually casting their ballot, those aren't going to be considered either when talking about voter irregularities and concerning the outcome of an election. So you would have two Supreme Court decisions on either side. One saying voter irregularities causing an increase in votes, and voter irregularities causing a decrease in votes. Neither would be subject to actually appeal the result of an election. That's dangerous, because what the Supreme Court would essentially be saying on those two separate decisions is there's virtually no avenue for appeal to overturn or annul an election result based on voting irregularities caused by administrative issues by Elections Canada. That's the big problem here. And so what we were saying is this is why the lower court was misapplying the law, because they didn't even consider this aspect of this earlier case, where the Supreme Court literally says, oh, this would be different if voters were casting their vote and they weren't actually able to put it in. So that's the issue here. So we were saying back then that the Supreme Court has to overturn this. Otherwise, this is going to cause a dangerous precedent. And the Bloc should pick up their phone right away, get their lawyer, and get on this. So that's what they did. So here's a little bit of insight of what happened when that oral decision was presented. Before the country's highest court delivered its verdict, Marc-Étienne Vienne, lawyer for Auguste, that's the Liberal, faced a barrage of questions from the justices. As Vienne argued that the Bloc Québécois voter whose special ballot had been returned to her, quote, was not prevented from voting, end quote, Chief Justice Richard Wagner interrupted him. Quote, hold on a minute, end quote, the judge told him. Quote, the purpose of the law is to promote public participation at a time in history when institutions are under strain, end quote. This was the beginning of a series of interruptions. Quote, it seems to me that the responsibility is perfectly clear. The responsibility for this problem today lies with Elections Canada, not with the voter who cast her ballot by mail, end quote, Justice Malcolm Rowe said without even asking Vienne a question. Vienne said invalidating the election required, quote, a serious error associated with fraud, end quote. Now, this is the big problem that was in the lower court case, because they were trying to say irregularities must be associated with malice and or fraud. And this was a misreading of the Elections Act. And we went through that, but we'll just go through that very quickly here. So this is from the Canada Elections Act. And it's section 524, contestation of election. Any elector who is eligible to vote in an electoral district and any candidate in any electoral district may, by application to a competent court, contest the election in that electoral district on the grounds that A, under section 65, the elected candidate was not eligible to be a candidate, which didn't apply here, or, this is the big one, B, there were irregularities, comma, fraud, or corrupt or illegal practices that affected the result of the election. This is the problem. So what the Liberal lawyer is trying to argue, and it's what the lower court judge accepted, is that this is not a list. This is a single statement. So they're trying to say there were irregularities that was fraud or corrupt or illegal practices that affected the result of the election. But grammar is important, and the Liberals need to know how to use commas. Because this reads, there were irregularities, and you could replace that comma with a or, fraud, or corrupt or illegal practices, and then what did that lead to? An effect that resulted the outcome of the election. So this is the big difference, and this is where Vienne and the lower court judge completely bungled this up. I'm not going to say the Liberal lawyer bungled it up. The Liberal lawyer probably knows darn well what that meant, but wanted the judge to agree with them, and the lower court judge did, but the Supreme Court is saying, hang on a second here. So the Liberal lawyer goes on. He added that lowering the threshold for challenging an election could create, quote, a problematic precedent, end quote. This isn't about a breach of procedures or Election Canada's responsibilities, end quote, said Vienne. It is simply a routine clerical error. The Supreme Court decision to invalidate this result would leave the Liberals with 168 seats in the House of Commons, short of the 172 required to form a majority government. The new ruling also rejects an earlier decision from October, which is the one we've talked about, when a Superior Court judge denied St. Clair Degagné's request for a new election, saying the quote-unquote human error did not affect the integrity of the Canadian electoral system. The Bloc said it was thrilled with Friday's ruling, noting it reaffirms that the right to vote is fundamental in a democracy. Quote, Now that the seat is vacant, we are demanding that the by-election be called without delay so that Terrebonne residents can go to the polls rapidly, end quote, said Suzanne Proulx, president of the bloc. Liberal Party of Canada spokesman Matteo Rossi said the party respects the ruling and is ready for another campaign in the Terrebonne riding. In most cases, by-elections must be called within 6 months of a seat being vacated. And this is where we are. So remember, Supreme Courts, when they're reviewing decisions on appeal, they're mostly looking at, did the lower court judge apply the law correctly in his ruling? And thankfully, we were correct in this. Because if we were not, and the Supreme Court did accept the lower court ruling, this would have set a very, very scary precedent in that Elections Canada could make any mistake that they want. And there would be virtually no avenue legally to challenge it in court, which is the whole point of the Elections Act. It's literally spelled out. This is what you do. And the Liberals are trying to argue, well, because it was human error, it shouldn't matter. It must be intentional. No. I'm sorry. I don't think any Canadian in support of any party would agree with that. Human error is a problem. But in every case where there's serious repercussions, where humans are involved and human errors are involved, there's usually controls or corrections to go along with that. So if there's a serious human error, you fix that. And in this case, we're talking about a very important tenet of our democracy, which is our elections. So this has given me more faith that our courts can make the right decisions. So that's a good thing. And it's given me more faith that as clunky as our system is, sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't. But in this case, they finally came to the right decision. So we're actually not doing too bad in 2026 for court decisions. First, we got the reaffirmation of the Emergencies Act. Then we got the decision that the We Charity scandal is actually going to be heard in court. And now we heard that the Supreme Court is annulling the Terrebonne by-election, rightfully so. So now Natalie St. Clair Desgagnés and the Bloc go head-to-head with the Liberals and try to take that seat back. And for the sake of a continued minority government, that's all we can hope for is a Bloc win.